This is from Notes from Underground. So this is someone who's in the underground. And that's where you go when your value systems collapse. I'm a sick man. I'm a spiteful man. I'm an unattractive man. I believe my liver is diseased. However, I know nothing at all about my disease and do not know for certain what ails me. I don't consult a doctor for it and never have, although I have a respect for medicine and doctors. Besides, I'm extremely superstitious, sufficiently so to respect medicine anyway. I am well educated enough not to be superstitious, but I am superstitious. No, I refuse to consult a doctor from spite. That you will probably not understand. Well, I understand it, though. Of course, I can't explain who it is precisely that I'm mortifying, in this case by my spite. I'm perfectly well aware that I cannot pay out the doctors and extract revenge by not consulting them. I know better than anyone that by all this I'm only injuring myself and no one else. But still, if I don't consult a doctor, it's from spite. My liver is bad. Well, let it get worse. Now, he's a civil servant. A low-ranking civil servant. And he's retired because he got a little bit of inheritance. He says, when petitioners used to come for information to the table at which I sat, I used to grind my teeth at them. And I felt intense enjoyment when I succeeded in making anybody unhappy. I almost always succeeded. For the most part, they were all timid people. Of course, they were petitioners. But you know, gentlemen, what was the chief point about my spite? Well, the whole point, the real sting of it lay in the fact that continually, even in the moment of the acutest spleen, I was inwardly conscious with shame that I was not only not spiteful, but not even embittered, and that I was simply scaring sparrows at random and amusing myself by it. I was lying when I just said now that I was a spiteful official. I was lying from spite. I was simply amusing myself with the petitioners and with the officer, and in reality I never could become spiteful. I was conscious every moment in myself of many, very many elements absolutely opposite to that. I felt them positively swarming in me, these opposite elements. I knew that they had been swarming in me my whole life and craving some outlet from me, but I would not let them out. Would not let them purposefully would not let them out. They tormented me until I was ashamed. They drove me to convulsions and sickened me at last. At last, how they sickened me. Now, you're not fancying, gentlemen, that I am expressing remorse for something now, that I'm asking your forgiveness for something. I'm sure you're fancying that. However, I assure you I do not care if you are. It was not only that I could not become spiteful, I did not know how to become anything, neither spiteful nor kind, neither a rascal nor an honest man, neither a hero nor an insect. Now I'm living my life out in my corner, taunting myself with the spiteless and useless consolation that an intelligent man cannot become anything seriously, and it's only the fool who becomes anything. A direct person I regard as the real normal man. As his tender Mother Nature wished to see him, when she graciously brought him into being on the earth. I envy such a man till I'm green in the face. He's stupid. I'm not disputing that. But perhaps the normal man should be stupid. How do you know? Perhaps it's very beautiful, in fact. And I am the more persuaded of that suspicion, if one can call it so, by the fact that you take, for instance, the antithesis of the normal man, that is, the man of acute self-consciousness, who has come, of course, not out of the lap of nature, but out of a retort. This is also almost mysticism, gentlemen, but I suspect this too. This retort-made man is sometimes so nonplussed in the presence of his antithesis, the normal man, that with all his exaggerated self-consciousness, he genuinely thinks himself a mouse and not a man at all. It may be an acutely conscious mouse, yet it is a mouse. While the other is a man, and therefore, etc., etc. And the worst of it is, he himself, his very own self, looks on himself as a mouse. No one asks him to do so, and that's an important point. Now let us look at this mouse in action. Let us suppose, for instance, that it feels insulted. And it almost always feels insulted. And it wants to revenge itself too. There may even be a greater of accumulation of spite in it than in the man of nature and truth. The base and nasty desire to vent that spite on its assailant rankles perhaps even more nastily in it than in the man of nature and truth. For through his innate stupidity, the latter, the normal man, looks upon his revenge as justice, pure and simple. Well, in consequence of his acute self-consciousness, the mouse does not believe in any justice of it at all. To come at last to the deed itself, to the very act of revenge, apart from the one fundamental nastiness the luckless mouse succeeds in creating around it, so many other nastinesses in the form of doubts and questions, adds to the one question so many unsettled questions that there inevitably works around it, up around it, a sort of fatal brew, a stinking mess, made up of its doubts, emotions, and of the contempt spat upon it by the direct men of action, who stand solemnly about it as judges and arbitrators, laughing at it until their healthy sides ache. Of course, the only thing left for it is to dismiss all that with a wave of its paw and with a smile of assumed contempt in which it does not even itself believe, and creep ignominiously into its mouse hole. There, in its nasty, stinking, underground home, our insulted, crushed, and ridiculed mouse promptly becomes absorbed in cold, malignant, and above all, everlasting spite. For 40 years together, it will remember its injury down to the smallest, most ignominious details, and every time will add of itself details still more ignominious, spitefully teasing and tormenting itself with its own imagination. It will be ashamed of its imaginings, yet it will recall it all. It will go over and over every detail. It will invent unheard of things against itself, pretending that those things might have happened, and will forgive nothing. Maybe it will begin to revenge itself too, but as it were, piecemeal, in trivial ways, from behind the stove, incognito, without believing either in its own right to vengeance or in the success of its revenge, knowing that from all its efforts at revenge, it will suffer 100 times more than he on whom it revenges itself. Well, he, I dare say, will not even scratch itself. On its deathbed, it will recall it all over again, with interest accumulated over all the years. Now, the idea that Nietzsche and Dostoevsky were developing was that the dawning consciousness in Western society of the mythological substructure of the value system and the impossibility of conceptualizing that or proving the validity of its structure from scientific means doomed the people who were encapsulated in that system to formal disbelief in it. And what they concluded from that was exactly what Dostoevsky just described, which is that someone with that level of acute self-consciousness and cultural self-knowledge would immediately become fragmented beyond belief, unable to act, unhappy, resentful, and dangerous. And both Dostoevsky and Nietzsche in their works, and Dostoevsky developed this idea most particularly in a novel called The Devils, said that once that you had got to that point, which was inevitable if you were smart enough to take seriously what was going on, it was only a tiny step to identification with a murderous ideology. Now, some of the existentialists started to work up what you might regard as a solution to this problem. And I'm going to read Kierkegaard's solution. It is now, Kierkegaard was a Danish existential philosopher, and he lived earlier than Nietzsche. And he was, in some sense, you might think about him as the first modern psychologist. He was the first person to conceptualize, for example, of the separate entity of anxiety and despair. It is now about 4 years ago that I got the notion of wanting to try my luck as an author. I remember it quite clearly. It was on a Sunday. Yes, that's it, a Sunday afternoon. I was seated as usual out of doors at the cafe in the Fredericksburg Garden. I'd been a student for half a score of years. Although never lazy, all my activity nevertheless was like a glittering inactivity. A kind of occupation for which I still have a great partiality, and for which I perhaps even have a little genius. I read much, spent the remainder of the day idling and thinking, or thinking and idling, but that was all it came to. So I sat there and smoked my cigar until I lapsed into thought. Among other thoughts, I remember these. You are going on, I said to myself, to become an old man, without being anything and without really undertaking to do anything. On the other hand, wherever you look around you in life, and in literature, you see the celebrated names and figures, the precious and much heralded men who are coming into prominence and who are much talked about. The many benefactors of the age who know how to benefit mankind by making life easier and easier. Some by railways, others by omnibuses and steamboats, others by telegraph, others by easily apprehended compendiums and short recitals of everything worth knowing. And finally, the true benefactors of the age who make spiritual existence easier and easier, yet more and more significant. And what are you doing? Here my soliloquy was interrupted, for my cigar was smoked out, and a new one had to be lit. So I smoked again. And then suddenly this thought flashed through my mind. You must do something. But inasmuch with your limited capacities, it will be impossible to make anything easier than it has become. You must, with the same humanitarian enthusiasm as the others, undertake to make something harder. This notion pleased me immensely, and at the same time it flattered me to think that I, like the rest of them, would be loved and esteemed by the whole community. For when all combine in every way to make everything easier, there remains only one possible danger, namely, that the ease becomes so great that it becomes altogether too great. Then there is only one want left, though it is not yet a felt want, when people will want difficulty. Out of love for mankind and out of despair at my embarrassing situation, seeing that I had accomplished nothing and was unable to make anything easier than it already was, and moved by a genuine interest in those who make everything easy, I conceived it as my task to create difficulties everywhere. Same idea in different words. A traveler, this is Nietzsche, and this is part of the development of his answer to the conundrum that he raised. A traveler who had seen many countries and peoples and several continents was asked what human traits he had found everywhere, and he answered, men are inclined to laziness. Some will feel that he might have said with greater justice, they are all timid. They hide behind customs and opinions. At bottom, however, every human being knows very well that he is in this world just once as something unique, and that no accident, however strange, will throw together a second time into a unity such a curious and diffuse plurality. He knows it, but he hides it like a bad conscience. Why? From fear of his neighbor, who insists on convention and veils himself with it. But what is it that compels the individual human being to fear his neighbor and to think and act herd fashion and not to be glad of himself? A sense of shame, perhaps, in a few rare cases. In the vast majority, it's the desire for comfort and inertia. In short, that inclination to laziness of which the traveler spoke. He's right. Men are even lazier than they are timorous. And what they fear most is the troubles with which any unconditional honesty and nudity would burden them. Only artists hate this slovenly life in borrowed manners and loosely fitting opinions and unveil the secret, everybody's bad conscience. The principle that every human being is a unique wonder. They dare to show us the human being as he is, down to the last muscle, himself and himself alone. Even more, that in this rigorous consistency of his uniqueness, he is beautiful and worth contemplating, as novel and as incredible as any work of nature, and by no means dull. When a great thinker despises men, it's their laziness that he despises. For it is on account of this that they have the appearance of factory products and seem indifferent and unworthy of companionship or instruction. The human being who does not wish to belong to the mass must merely cease being comfortable with himself. Let him follow his conscience, which shouts at him, "Be yourself." What you are at present doing, opining, and desiring, that's not really you. That's Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and existentialism. That's the bare beginning of the thinking.